All right, we are in our second to last adult Bible class on the rise and falls of Joseph. Just as a little kind of another way of reframing the build-up that's gotten us to Genesis chapter 48, I think one way of understanding the life of Joseph is to think about all of the different houses he lives in. So in the very beginning, we see that he's born into the house of Jacob, his father, and that's where he first has this identity of being a dreamer. He has dreams and interprets his own dreams, and he naively tells his brothers and his father about these dreams, and they imply with no uncertain terms that his brothers will bow down to him, that he will rule over them in some way. Later on, because his brothers sell him into slavery in Egypt, he ends up a servant in the house of Potiphar. One of the other instances of Joseph being foolish, not necessarily wicked or evil, but one of the instances of him being foolish is to continue to go into the house of Potiphar while Potiphar's wife is trying to seduce him. And there are no witnesses around for this, and he ends up being in a fraught situation with her. Because of false accusations made by Potiphar's wife about Joseph, he ends up in the house of the prison warden. He ends up in that dungeon, and he is an interpreter down there, but he is downcast because he is forgotten, and so much of his life has been kind of going downhill. So this is the major downhill trajectory in Joseph's life, but then there's a final ascent in Joseph's life. He goes all the way up to be second in command in the house of Pharaoh, in the court, as a court official, replacing the vacancy left by the chief baker, and he rules and has dominion in Egypt, and he's second only to the Egyptian ruler Pharaoh. He ends up becoming a mediator between his father and brothers when they come into Egypt, and we saw the whole family reconcile together, both brothers and father. They all come together. They live together in the land of Goshen. And Joseph acts as a reconciler. He brings people together who did not trust each other at all. Last week, when we were talking about Genesis chapter 47 and 48, we made two different major observations. The first observation was that Joseph's leadership is totally contrasted with the next Pharaoh's leadership. So at the end of Genesis, Joseph is this masterful leader over the country of Egypt, and he serves all of these people so well. The next Pharaoh in the beginning of the book of Exodus is contrasted with him in every single way. Joseph does everything he can in the midst of difficult circumstances to serve the common good of all people under his dominion. The new Pharaoh, who doesn't remember Joseph, is a terrible leader. In a decadent and prosperous society, he decides to enjoy this prosperity at the expense of a few. He enslaves the Israelites. He makes them build up large storehouses for his own goods. And so these two leaders are totally contrasted. There's the wise and righteous leader of Joseph, and then the evil, foolish, almost satanic ruler in Pharaoh. The second observation is that already in the first book of the Old Testament, we see the presence of Gentiles. This is a term we see used, I would say, much more frequently in the New Testament. We see this distinction between Jew and Gentile, and how Jesus unites Jews and Gentiles in the church. But you might think, well, we only talk about that in the New Testament, but in reality, we get tons of stories and commentary on this relationship between the Jewish people and Gentile nations. And it can be challenging to know that God picked one particular nation, the nation of Abraham, the Jews or Israel, and he decides to bless the world through them. But he specifically chooses Abraham and Abraham's family. But the intent from the beginning was to always bless the whole world through that one nation. So God never wanted to just bless one group of people. He wanted to bless all groups of people through that one particular group. And Christians can obviously see how Jesus is the fulfillment of that blessing. Obviously, Jesus saves both Jew and Gentile, but we need to see that Gentiles are already there in the beginning of the story. Judah accidentally sleeps with his Canaanite daughter-in-law named Tamar, thinking that she was a prostitute. We talked about that story a few weeks ago. And he produces 2 heirs through that woman. And one of those heirs is named Perez, who ends up being the ancestor of King David. So already the tribe of Judah is half Canaanite through their mother Tamar. A few chapters ago, we saw that Joseph has an Egyptian wife named Asenath, and he has 2 sons as well, Ephraim and Manasseh. So he has 2 sons that are half Egyptian. So what's interesting is that Joseph and Judah, who seem to be the 2 brothers rising to the top of the 12 tribes of Israel, both have 2 sons, both of whom are half Gentile through their mothers. It's clear that from the very first book of the Bible, that the story of Jews and Gentiles is bound up together. You can't totally separate them. Egypt and Israel actually have this moment of peaceful coexistence together. They bless one another instead of cursing one another. We talked about how crucial that is to see that this is already a fulfillment of what God promised Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. I will bless those who bless you. So when Gentile nations bless the Jews, when Gentile nations bless God's chosen people, they are blessed in response. Now, we hinted at this last week, but we're going to read about Jacob's deathbed blessings. This is in the second to last chapter of the book of Genesis. And deathbed blessings are common in the Old Testament. We see Isaac blesses Jacob on accident because he's old and has poor eyesight. We see in Deuteronomy 33 that Moses blesses and pronounces blessings over the Israelites before his death. This is a pattern over and over again. Right on their deathbeds, these leaders of God's people will bless God's people. They are sure to say something before they go. And these blessings are more than just like nice words. They're more than just a card you might write to someone during the holidays. Though those are good, these blessings make an impact. They're very powerful. The words themselves affect what they say. They predict what is going to unfold. Jacob himself says at the beginning, "Gather around so I can tell you what will happen to you in days to come." So these blessings are not just nice words of encouragement. These words are going to speak about the future. They're going to say something about the history of God's people and what's going to come. This is an explicit prediction. So these blessings are not something that they can take back. We see that with Isaac when he blesses Jacob. After he blesses Jacob, that's it. It's done. There are no takebacks to these. These words are powerful and you can't revoke them. So Jacob gets his 12 sons together. They're all in the land of Egypt, and he says, "Assemble and listen, sons of Jacob, listen to your father Israel." And he begins with his firstborn. He says, "Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength, excelling in honor, excelling in power. Turbulent as the waters, you will no longer excel, for you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it." Now, if you don't know, Reuben as the firstborn kind of has a tragic story, and this is true of Ishmael, this is true of Esau, this is true of many firstborns throughout the book of Genesis. Reuben is the firstborn, and he has a tragic story. He's the firstborn of Leah, the less favored wife of Jacob. And after Rachel, the beloved wife, passes away, there are 3 women in Jacob's life who are important. Leah, who's Reuben's mother, Zilpah, and then Leah's Rachel's servant, Bilhah. So Leah, Zilpah, and Bilhah. And Bilhah is one of Jacob's concubines. So he has his 2 wives who were sisters, Leah and Rachel, and then their 2 servants, Zilpah and Bilhah. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of family dysfunction about this. But one of the things that we find out that Reuben does is he sleeps with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. This is actually something common in the ancient Near East. Ancient Near Eastern culture, for a man to supplant another man by sleeping with his concubines. We actually see this happen later with David and some of his sons. And it's a kind of way of expressing dominance. It was to say, these women don't belong to you now, they belong to me. And so we know that Reuben did this. Jacob knows that his own son did this to him. And so he tells him, because of his sin, because of his actions, he's no longer going to excel. At first, he was excellent, but he's no longer going to do so. And obviously that story is very strange to us, but it's important to know that Reuben's life actually goes downhill way before Jacob ever says this. Reuben attempts to save Joseph's life, but it doesn't really work. He fails then. He attempts to bargain for Simeon's life, and that also fails. He is a failed firstborn son. He doesn't rise to the occasion. He doesn't accept the responsibility of being the firstborn, and he does poorly. And so Jacob tells him so. He says, you will no longer succeed. You will no longer do well because you defiled my bed. And here's the thing. The second and third born sons actually don't fare much better. Jacob says to his son Simeon and Levi, you are brothers. Their swords are weapons of violence. Let me not enter into their council. Let me not join their assembly, for they have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. Now, if you don't remember this story, this is a callback to previous chapters in Genesis. Simeon and Levi found out that one of their neighboring Gentile men named Shechem had seduced their sister Dinah. Shechem was obsessed with her. He couldn't think about anything else. He seduces her. They sleep together. And then he has the audacity to go to Simeon and Levi, the rest of her brothers, and her father, and he offers to pay the bride price. Now, there's no way that message, that offer, doesn't come off as, it's just horrible. Basically, what he says is, now that I slept with your sister, now that she's not a virgin anymore, can I pay you off with money so that you're not mad at me anymore? That's basically what this guy Shechem was saying. And they say, this guy is treating our sister like a prostitute. He sleeps with her and then offers us the money for it. So Simeon and Levi get justifiably upset about this, but what they do is they deceive Shechem and the rest of the men in the city. They come upon them, they kill all of the men in the city in one night. They basically pillage and burn the whole place down, and then they take all of the women who are now widows and all of the possessions there and come home. And obviously they're justified in their anger towards Shechem because of his treatment of their sister, but they use violence to make themselves feel better. They create a bunch of widows due to their evil, and they basically do worse than Shechem ever did. And so Jacob basically says, this is what you're going to face because of your behavior. I'm going to scatter and disperse you. And we actually see this happen in the tribe of Simeon. The rest of the story of the Old Testament shows us this. Because of what they do, Simeon is the only tribe that Moses doesn't bless in Deuteronomy 33. According to Joshua 19, Simeon is only given a few cities in the territory of Judah, and eventually Judah just absorbs Simeon, and they seem to disappear. Levi doesn't get its own territory because they become priests, and they get select cities again. So what Jacob says right here comes to pass. It comes true. These are not just empty words or nice words of encouragement. These are prediction and prophecies about the future, and they actually happen. Simeon and Levi's tribes, all of their descendants, are impacted by their decisions right here. But here's the thing. Things totally change when Jacob gets to the blessing of his son Judah. Look at how much space and words he gives to him, to his fourth-born son. He says, Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons, that's your brothers, will bow down to you. You're a lion's cub, Judah. You return from the prey. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? This verse is so crucial. The scepter, that is a ruler's royal staff, will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. He will tether his donkey to a vine, his colts to the choicest branch. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes will be darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. Now, this blessing is a promise of kingship. All the language here about the scepter, the ruler's staff between his feet, the obedience of the nations. These are all clues to a messianic prophecy. The Jewish commentators always talked about how this passage, which is used later on in Scripture, is about the coming Messiah. The Messiah, the long-awaited King of Israel, will come from the line of Judah. And this idea of kingship actually was promised to Abraham. Not a lot of us remember this about Abraham's promise. We remember God says, go to the land I will show you, and I'm going to make your descendants very numerous. I'm going to give you a great name. I'm going to make you a great nation. But God says in Genesis 17 to Abraham, I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. And God extends that promise to Jacob. Back in Genesis chapter 35, he says, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and community of nations will come from you, and kings will be among your descendants. So Jacob got that promise that God originally made to Abraham. It was extended to him, and now he's giving it to his son, a particular son, Judah. Now, this is kind of strange if you know all that Judah has done. This is kind of shocking in light of the sins he's committed. We know that he sold Joseph into slavery. We know that Judah slept with his daughter-in-law Tamar. We know that he has clearly made mistakes. But obviously, at the same time, he has become a changed man. His story has come full circle, and God has changed him throughout this story. He confessed to and admitted that Tamar was more righteous than him. He offered himself in the place of Benjamin and protected his younger brother. Judah's story was actually redeemed, and I think that explains a lot of the blessing here. Because Judah has become a changed man, because he stepped up where Reuben and Simeon and Levi stepped down, he was given this blessing. He was rewarded for his behavior, and his father promises him something great in light of that. The next 6 brothers, I would say, get blessings that are overall better than the first 3, but definitely not as prominent as Judah. Zebulun is promised some economic and land and material blessings. Issachar is kind of receives a very mysterious blessing or promise, and it's unclear to many commentators what Jacob actually means. Dan is told that he will provide justice as a tribe, and that might be a reference to Samson, who comes from the tribe of Dan and is a judge. Gad is told that he will attack and be attacked, which is pretty vague if you ask me. And Naphtali is told that he is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Some of these are not given much commentary among biblical scholars. There's lots of attempted connections, but these blessings are not as clear as the first 4 sons of Israel. Those give much more clarity about the future of Israel's history in the Old Testament. Now, as expected, Joseph actually gets a very large blessing too. Jacob says about his son, Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring whose branches climb over a wall. With bitterness, archers attack him. This is a not so subtle reference to his brothers who are standing in the room as Jacob blesses Joseph. Joseph is second in command in Egypt, and he says, yeah, at one point in your life, you were attacked. Clearly, this is about Joseph's brothers. You were shot at with hostility, but your bow remained steady. Your strong arms stayed limber, not because of his own strength, but because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel, because of your father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you with the blessings of the skies above, blessings of the deep springs below, blessings of the breast and womb. Your father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains, than the bounty of the age-old hills. Let all of these, which he said blessings like 40 times right there, let all of these blessings rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. This is the only one that can come close to comparing to the blessing of Judah. Clearly, Jacob wants to bless the future of the tribe of Joseph. And it's hard to know which blessing is greater. I personally think that the blessing of Judah is greater than the blessing of Joseph. Joseph is certainly called the prince among his brothers. He has a royal position right now in the official court of Pharaoh. But the bottom line is that the kingship of Israel comes from the line of Judah. And we see that in David. We see that in his son Solomon. We see that in all of the southern kings of Judah. And we see that ultimately in Jesus. Jesus is from the line of Judah, not from the line of Joseph. But the last blessing for the 12th and final son of Israel is kind of surprising. All it says is, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, and in the evening he divides the plunder. Now, for all of Jacob's supposed love for Benjamin, this seems weak. This is all we're told about him. Now, I think that this sets up an inevitable tension between the tribes of Judah and the tribes of Benjamin. We know that they end up living in the southern part of the promised land together. We know that those two tribes ultimately vie for the kingship. We see that the first king of Israel, Saul, comes from the tribe of Benjamin, and he ultimately fails. Saul tragically loses the kingship because he greedily takes plunder during a battle in 1 Samuel 15. And isn't it amazing that so many years earlier, Jacob, his father, said to Benjamin, in the evening he divides the plunder. This is already a prophecy about Saul's future behavior. And we're going to see that Judah and Benjamin are going to be at odds with one another. They're going to fight, and Benjamin as a tribe will often fail, which is very surprising in light of the very small role he plays in the book of Genesis, but also the fact that Jacob loved Benjamin. So sometimes these blessings are not just the preferences of Jacob. I don't think that he's just saying who he loves the most. He obviously loves Joseph the most. He's been devastated by Joseph's absence for all these years. He clearly is obsessed with this son from his beloved wife Rachel. But the biggest blessing goes to Judah, not to Joseph. And a very tiny blessing, if anything, goes to Benjamin. Now, this is the last little paragraph in about Jacob's life, and it's about the end of it. He says to his sons, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. There Abraham and his wife were buried. Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried there. I buried Leah there, and I want to be buried there too. The field and the cave in it were bought from the Hittites. It belongs to us, is what he's saying. And when Jacob had finished giving instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. We've been with Jacob for a long time. We've mostly been focusing on his son Joseph. But if you're familiar with the life of Jacob, it's been a very rocky and eventful story. He began by coming out of the womb after his older twin brother Esau. He was wrestling with him from the beginning. He always wanted a blessing from God, his father, and eventually he blesses his sons as their father. And right here at the end, he blesses all of them, and some of those blessings are harder to swallow than others. They clearly don't fit perfectly with Jacob's own preferences for his kids, but he makes prophetic statements about the future for all of the tribes that come from them. And so he dies here at the end and has these very specific instructions about being buried in a cave. And I don't know about you, but the Bible doesn't always give a ton of detailed info about things that we might want to know. And right here, it gives a bunch of detailed information about stuff that we might honestly not care much about. But I want to make a connection to the New Testament that I think is really interesting. A lot of us have a picture that comes to us during the holidays about the nativity of Christ, the birthplace of Christ. And a lot of us have an image that Jesus is born in a stable. Now, that doesn't come from the Gospel of Matthew. We're not given a ton of information from Matthew. We get more of our information about the nativity from Luke's Gospel. We're told in chapter 2 of Luke's Gospel that Jesus' parents went from Nazareth, which is where they lived, kind of in the nowhere part of Israel, the place of nobodies in Galilee. And they lived up there, but they went down to Bethlehem for the census. They traveled all the way there, and Mary gave birth to Jesus. We're told that she wrapped him in clothes, and then we're told she placed him in a manger. Now, if you know anything about scholarly debates about this, you can get a very heated debate going if you want to ask, where was Jesus born? Now, we know mangers are kind of long, open boxes or troughs that animals will eat food out of. And a lot of us picture a manger in a stable because the picture we have is that farmers and people who take care of livestock will create a specific stable, a separate building for the animals to live in. And then whenever people running over overseeing livestock will go to the stable to get the animals. And so we picture Mary and Jesus and Joseph in the stable. But that actually might not be accurate because ancient overseers of livestock would actually keep their animals in caves. Caves were used for many different purposes. They were used for dwellings, for fortresses, for refuge, for cisterns, for prisons, for graveyards. Caves were used for all kinds of things. Travelers would use them as inns, robbers as dens, herdsmen as stalls, you name it. Caves were used for a lot of things, and they were also used as ancient stables where animals would go and where Mary and Joseph and Jesus might have been when Mary gave birth, which means that all of the patriarchs and matriarchs in Genesis were buried in a cave together. Abraham, Sarah, Rebekah, Isaac, now Leah, and Jacob, all buried in a cave. But centuries after they died, a descendant came and was born in a cave, in the ancient stable. And out of that cave came Jesus Christ. So, it's a possibility that one connecting theme, starting all the way in the book of Genesis to Jesus, is that his patriarchs and matriarchs, his great-great-great-great-grandparents were all buried in a cave. But he was born in a cave. And when he came into the world, that signaled life for his ancestors who were buried in a cave, such that all of them would one day come out and rise from the dead from those caves. So, what meant death to the patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel meant life in Jesus Christ. Next week, we're going to talk about the final reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. But I just want to end on that note that Jesus, all those centuries later, brought life into the world in the cave which was associated with death.